So here we are, prepared to discuss the whole question of the opening up of actual globalization in the early 1970s with the oil shocks. So here we're beginning to talk about the crisis of the American capitalism and its attempt to find a way out of all the difficulties it was facing at the end of the 60s. And so I look at this whole thing in terms of a revolution and an escape forward by the people in power. So a very decisive series of state actions taken at the top, and in the spirit of a globalized vision, which really emerged, I think, and owing to the prompting of the failures of the previous policies in the 1960s. So I call the title of this thing the revolution and the fuite en avant. I use a French phrase here, means escape forward and escape forward. The revolution and the escape forward of 1969 through 1976, through the end of the end of the Ford administration, the beginning of the Carter administration. So the Republicans are going to have power throughout this period, and it's the Republican Party who's going to make the decisions. And it's a party that is newly armed in a certain political sense, completely apart from the colossal economic and social crisis they're facing. They're politically armed inside the United States because they're now beginning to contemplate the possibility that civil rights movement of the 1960s has affected a realignment in American politics so that the South is no longer going to be Democratic and it is now going to be Republican. So it is a newly armed Republican Party which now has the political power of the South, the American South, resistant now to civil rights, bear in mind, because this is a party of the right. So these are fairly complex kinds of things to contemplate when we think about the economic turn that's made at this time, but I think they're really necessary in order to get the idea of the changes that were prompting these big decisions. So in my reading of the thing, there was an enormous revolutionary tide at the end of the 1960s. I should speak a little bit more about this idea, perhaps I will in a minute, speak about this idea of revolution, but suffice it to say that the people in power now had to contemplate the fact that most of their big cities were erupting quite regularly every summer, with big rebellions in the black neighborhoods, which at that time they called ghettos, the black neighborhoods. And these are very violent risings of the black youth. And really they represent something rather different from what Martin Luther King had been leading in the South, mostly a struggle that's being waged by church-going, middle-class black people, middle-aged, for the most part. There are plenty of young people involved in it. There's SNCC, of course, and all the work that it did in the South Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But on the whole, it is led by a fairly sophisticated and mature leadership with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King at its head. The risings in the North are a different animal altogether. They represent a turn in the civil rights movement, a turn away from the nonviolence of Martin Luther King, toward a new, much more ambitious kind of black power, is what it was called at the time, black power concept, as argued by people like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, and eventually by the Black Panther Party and by related organizations as well. So this is a kind of a black nationalism, at least in the beginning, it was a kind of a black nationalism, this black power movement. By the time it reaches the 1966 mark and Martin Luther King starts to take it, or I should say the Black Panther Party start to have a big influence in it. It doesn't represent, strictly speaking, the narrow nationalism that it started out with, but something a little bit different, some kind of an attempt at a rising in the name of local power. Power to the people was the slogan, and what they meant by that was that the powers ought to be able to run their own communities. I should say the communities ought to be able to run their own areas, ought to be able to control their own police force, ought to be able to elect presumably a black mayor in a big black town, and that all of the different neighborhoods should have power. I mean, I don't know if you could say that this is a really revolutionary concept in the sense that it looked toward the seizure of power, toward the assumption of power. It doesn't seem to promise much in that regard, but it does hold up the idea that there's a sort of a rainbow coalition, and so various other organizations very quickly took up the same cry that the Black Panthers issued. So you have the Young Lords and you have the Young Patriots in Chicago, and then a big section of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, the biggest student organization on the American campuses, was very favorable to the Black Panther Party, really wanted to link up with it. And on what basis? I think you just have to say the basis of a very radical statement, of a statement that everyone called revolutionary at the time, and to march forward on that basis. I don't think anybody had a very clear idea where that whole thing was going. They knew it was going to be a big disruptive effect, going to have a big disruptive effect on society at large. And they call that revolutionary at the time. Everybody used the word revolutionary. It wasn't enough to be a militant, to be in favor of civil rights, in opposition to the war in Vietnam. Now people began to say it was a matter of revolution. These big black rebellions with burning up the cities, which occurred every summer in 67, 68, 69, and all the major, just about every major city in the north of the United States. It not happened so much in the south, but mainly in the north of the United States. These things added a very violent, how to put it, very violent setting to the whole thing. After all, these are the biggest cities in the country, and Washington D.C. was no exception. There were enormous violent rebellions and burning in Washington, D.C. on the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1967. So this is a kind of a regular occurrence. Then you have very powerful mass student demonstrations in the thousands, tens of thousands, almost getting to the point where we have hundreds of thousands. One demonstration that was held in Golden Gate Park out at the polo fields. People said that was around 200,000 people there. So these are giant demonstrations that are being held in most of the big towns against the Vietnam War. So that represents another aspect of this thing. And is it a revolutionary thing? I mean, most people use that word, revolution. We're all revolutionaries. They make a clenched fist, the V sign, which started out signifying peace. No one did the V anymore. They all did the clench fist, which signifies revolution. So urban rebellions and anti-war student demonstrations, they're rife at this time. And the feeling is that there's going to be something big coming up in the United States, and it's replicated in Europe by a big student movement in Europe that comes out very strongly in May of 1968. And they staged a general strike with about 14 million workers out on strike. They absolutely closed the whole city of Paris down. So that looked very revolutionary at the time. And this photo, of course, says the workers and the students are united. By the way, that strike began with a student strike. The workers who shut the city down with a general strike were lending their support to student demands that were made at the University of Paris branch at Nanterre, out in the suburbs of Paris. So it's a vast worker-student movement, a whole generation, young workers, you could say, and students making a kind of a link up, common cause, common sensibility. And it's international, it's pretty much all over Europe, but it had its most violent expression in the May-June events of 1968 in Paris. At the same time, they have to contemplate the dollar as becoming unhinged from gold. The soldiers are in revolt, in effect, in Vietnam. The year 1969 is the year that the U.S. Army pretty much broke under the pressure of a losing war, and you had big rebellions in the ranks among the troops in Vietnam. So these rebellions are not they're not mere protests, but they're usually refusals to fight. So the troops are mutinying. Think of that, a drafted army. And the troops are refusing to fight. They're in full mutiny. And now we learn a new word, fragging, which means rolling a fragmentation grenade under the tent flap of your officers and killing your officers. And that was going on. So that things got to the point in Vietnam where the troops couldn't be relied on to carry out any missions. If you really wanted to have some kind of give some kind of an order to the troops, you'd have to consult with them. You'd have to call a meeting and practically take a vote in order to get the troops to fight. So not only are they refusing to fight, but they are mutinying against their officers. So that is definitely a sign that things have reached the point of the revolution. The army is broken. Imagine if this war was being fought in Mexico or Canada rather than overseas, whether this army revolting against its officers in such a violent way and refusing to fight, presenting the country with losing the war, in effect. And that is what was happening. And they were able to march home and participate in perhaps with their weapons as they did in Russia in 1917 and participate in the discussions as to how to change things inside their home country, march home with their weapons. So that was a huge thing that happened in the Russian Revolution. Well, there's kind of a suggestion of this in the events in the United States. As we also said, the dollar unhinged from gold now from 1968 on. It's $35 an ounce between 33 and 68. And now the dollar is going to be first $38 an ounce, and now it's going up. And so this run on gold, a run on the dollar, which occurs later on in 68, and actually during the Tet Offensive, an actual run on the dollar is changing the gold price. The whole international system is falling apart. Everything looks like it's collapsing. You would almost make the argument, who would want to take power under these circumstances? But if you did make that argument, you'd probably be wrong. It's still worth something to have control of the state, even no matter how bad things are. If you can't get your orders obeyed at the front, if you're losing a war, no matter how bad things get, if you have some control of state power, you've still got some cards to play. So there we are. Quite a situation in the United States. Demonstrations of supporters of the troops at home. General sense that the revolution has come. And perhaps we can ask this question in a little bit more precise way about revolution. Was it really a serious thing? And was there a real revolution? Well, I've seen everything from the standpoint of a fairly conscious observer of these things since those days. And I can say that's about the closest I ever saw to a real, genuinely revolutionary situation, which the government might have been overthrown if circumstances had been different. But what do we mean when we say that? And we say revolution? Certainly everybody talked revolution in those days. And certainly many people were seriously, passionately dedicated to revolution in those days. Certainly among the youth, many people. We really can't go into all the details of it within the circumstances of our inquiry. But we do have to ask the question because that has a huge effect, and I'm going to say it has the key effect on the formation of globalism in the form that we see it today. This threat of revolution at the end of the 60s. So the revolutionary 60s. How seriously should we take that idea, revolution? And what do we mean when we say revolution? What revolutions have we seen? What revolutions do we know about? Are we talking about the French Revolution, the American Revolution? Well, how about the Russian Revolution? That's something at least in our century. What was that? A mutiny. The troops wouldn't fight. That's the reason that the Tsar fell in 1917. I've written on this a lot. I've several books on this, as a matter of fact. But in the end, I feel that that's the heart of the matter when you ask the question why the Bolsheviks got power in Russia and why there was a socialist revolution in Russia at the end of World War I. It was because the troops wouldn't fight. There was a general mutiny. The Bolsheviks became the only party who came forward and said they were against the war. Every other party in Russia wanted to continue the war. So the workers turned to them as the party of, how to put it, anti-patriotism, at least to the extent of getting out of the war. The patriotism did not die. The Bolsheviks became patriots once they got power. But on this question of the war, the Bolsheviks were pretty adamant. They were against the war, and I think it's the anti-war position that they had that brought them to power. They were not the party most likely, even among the socialist parties. They were the most radical one, and I think they distinguished themselves in the war years by being against the war. So there it is. We have a situation quite analogous to that. I don't want to say it's a repetition of it, but analogous to that in the United States. There's a war in Vietnam. Get to the point where the troops won't fight. They've got to come home. Who's against the war? Who's for the war? The parties in 1968 that were vying for the control of the state, they offered themselves up with funny positions on the war. The Democrats under Hubert Humphrey said they were going to continue the war, but somehow look for a way out. Kind of an ambiguous position. The Republicans under Richard Nixon had a more anti-war position, at least it sounded and appeared that way. Nixon said, if after all these years in the war, nothing has panned out, we'll have to try new leadership. That was a very vague formula. But he also said he had a secret plan to get us out of the war, to stop the war, to end the war. And when he was pressed on it, he said, well, he couldn't exactly spill the beans about his secret plan because it would alert the other side and maybe it wouldn't work as well. And so typical thing that Richard Nixon was bound to say. But even so, I think he appeared to the public as more of an alternative. The Democrats had been in power for so long. Look at this long war. Maybe the only way out of it was to throw them out and to bring in a new party. Suppose that mutiny, that refusal to fight, that exhaustion with the war effort, which is quite comparable, in my opinion, in Russia in 1917 and America in 1968-9. Suppose the troops had been able to march home, as I have already suggested. And perhaps you could say there was an analogy. But if you can't say that, I mean, I say it is not in that position. It's got two oceans at its flanks. It's got the biggest ocean in the world between it and the war. It was in a position to bring the troops home. Richard Nixon, when he came into power, conferring with Henry Kissinger, immediately discussed with him, how are we going to get the troops home? We've got to get the troops home. And in the Nixon Doctrine, which he lays out in Guam in 1969, he says, we're definitely going to Vietnamize this war. We're going to get the American troops out. Henry Kissinger says, we knew we had to get them out, bring them home. disarmed, of course. We knew we had to bring them home. And we wanted to be careful not to bring them home too quickly because the public was so fed up with the war that they would want us to get out within a week. He said they would, the minute they started to see troops coming home, they'd say they want them all home, and immediately. It'd be like salted peanuts, he said. They couldn't stop until they got them all back, got them all home. Okay, so was that a revolution? Was it a situation like Russia? Yeah, I mean, more like Russia than any other situation I know about. You would think people who call themselves Marxists, Bolsheviks, whatever, in the United States would have seen some analogies. But that war situation, which is the real heart of the matter, the key, was not present. The distance, that war factor, the distance made it impossible for that war to be truly revolutionary and overthrow a government at home, as had been the case with the Bolsheviks. That's about the only time that the communists managed to make war. European communists, I mean, managed to make war. Pardon me, managed to make revolution is during time of war. So that's one model. Now, how about the other model that was being suggested at the time? People's War, a vast popular rising armed struggle. This is what the Black Panthers argued, and they're not the only ones. Many people on the left in the United States and Europe argued for armed struggle. What on earth does armed struggle mean? Armed struggle, obviously, on the model of the Chinese example and the Cuban example, I guess, where you're going to fight in the streets, or you're going to repair to some inaccessible area and build a guerrilla foco, as the phrase went. This was the phrase of Régis Debray, who wrote a book, Revolution in the Revolution, about Che Guevara and his activities in Latin America. And he drew the conclusion that this armed struggle was feasible. Is that what we're talking about? An armed struggle? Chinese revolution is made by Marxists and people who are definitely Bolsheviks, communists. They're in that same school of communists, at least in their ideological thinking about revolution. It's Marx, Engels, Lenin, not Trotsky, but Marx, Engels, Lenin. What are they saying exactly? They're arguing that the working class is not the key to the thing, that urban politics is not the key, that it's the peasantry. The Chinese think it's the peasantry. It's the people at large, and it's armed struggle. That is to say, civil war before the revolution in Russia in 1917, it was civil war, but it was after the Bolsheviks had taken power. They fought the civil war using the state against the civil war imposed by the right. So what are we talking about here? Talking about some kind of peasant revolt in the United States or Western Europe? No, makes no sense. Armed struggle? What does that mean exactly? Are there inaccessible areas, such as in China, or even in the jungles of Latin America? Are there inaccessible areas that guerrillas can hole up in? As a matter of fact, when I first started teaching, a faculty member from another department took me up on politics and was especially interested that I taught a course on the Russian Revolution, and was interested in this whole question of communism and all that. Would it be possible to make a revolution? And he asked me with a kind of an earnest way, did I think that it was possible to have armed struggle, in the mountains, in the United States? And I had to say, I thought the idea was absolutely bonkers. What could you say to such a thought? And he was very unhappy with this and did not talk to me ever again. I saw him again for many, many, many years, never talked to me again. Well, perhaps I had thrown cold water on a sentimental project for revolution. I don't know. So what was all this radicalism? What could it amount to in the United States? All this presumably revolutionary radicalism. Radicalism that wanted to have a revolution, wanted to be revolutionary. Well, they could have thrown themselves into some kind of social democratic movement compatible with democracy, consistent with the traditions of the country they live in, could have offered themselves as an alternative, could have worked toward a social democratic development. I think that was certainly possible. That did not really happen. The movement collapsed and in despair and was beaten back, persecuted by a government that the people on the left thought was fascist, quite fascist, exercised by Nixon and John Mitchell, his secretary, his attorney general. So this is the whole question of revolution that came up in the United States. We still see some of its violent aspects. J. Edgar Hoover and the Chicago police combining, according to the recent film that's been being shown widely about Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers murdering him. These are very violent kind of counter-revolutionary activities. It was a revolutionary period that called up everything a historian can recognize from these little snippets, these little photos we have of aspects of revolution. Not armed struggle, I don't think, though, and not what most Maoists in the United States, most of the leftists in the United States who call themselves revolutionaries probably were pretty close to calling themselves Maoists, and some actually were. So this was their actual program of armed struggle. So there's the problem. There's a problem for them. There's a problem for everybody, though. And their challenge, even though you may say that theoretically it doesn't work out in terms of long history of revolution, historian can't see any of the logic that will actually result in a genuinely revolutionary victory of any sort. Whatever you say about those things, it does represent the most fundamental possible challenge to the people in power. And that's sort of my theme, that the challenge was so great at that time. We haven't seen anything like it since, and certainly there was really nothing quite like it before. The challenge was so great, so fundamental, that it called forth a fundamental response, a renewal, an attempt at a flight forward, fuite en avant, an escape forward, and the construction of a whole series of big schemes. And those schemes are the foundation of globalism, which is what this course is supposed to be all about explaining. So those are the circumstances under which the globalization idea was born. So let's talk a little bit more about this escape. So it begins, first of all, with the problem of confronting I'm going backwards, am I not? Yes, I am. Let's go forward instead. It begins with the meeting of the wise men. Here you only see a couple of them, Clark Clifford, Dean Acheson, Secretary of State under Harry Truman, meeting with Lyndon Johnson about Vietnam. And you can't find a more adamant Cold Warrior than Dean Acheson, a person who advocated more sternly for building every possible weapon during the time he was in office, and even afterward, advocating for every possible armed conflict. And frequently, a person who almost didn't care about diplomacy, thought that every question could be answered by confronting the Soviets with more weapons. So you can't find a sterner Cold Warrior than Dean Acheson. But Dean Acheson told Lyndon Johnson, you can't win in Vietnam. You got to find a way. He was summing up more or less the opinion of the assembled wise men about whom I've spoken in the past, this meeting that took place in 1968 with Johnson, all of these major notables, important personages from diplomacy, from the business world, from finance, all the biggest big shots in the country. And speaking for them, Atchison put it very strongly to Lyndon Johnson, you cannot win. You got to find a way out. And more fundamentally, this whole Vietnam project was very half-baked. You have to do things that you can do, and not things that you want to do. So the main thing of foreign policy has to have is solvency. This was the slogan. You could say this was an elite slogan, if you want to put it that way. A slogan that was very, very popular in an elite discourse. The editors of Foreign Affairs, the leading periodical on American foreign policy, they formed a kind of a solvency school, and they argued for this idea. All over the world, we've got to take on commitments that can be taken on, and we've got to drop the ones that can't. So Nixon's idea of Vietnamization in the Guam Doctrine in 1969, that's solvency. That's the idea of backing off from commitments. The Russians would have used a French term used by Prince Gorchakov in the 1860s, recueillement, drawing back from major challenges in the world. Drawing back, retrenching. Retrenching is a good word. And that's what they were arguing to Johnson. You've got to back off this war. And at the same time, there was a feeling that some kind of rally of the elite was needed here. I mean, were they going to be pushed aside forever? Was this going to be an end to the whole free enterprise system? That was a question that was frequently asked. John D. Rockefeller, the grandson of the, one of the sons of the founder of Standard Oil and of the Rockefeller fortune, he wrote an earnest, heartfelt book about revolution at this point. He said there needed to be some kind of rally of the business community. And those who believed in free enterprise had to come forward and find a way for free enterprise to solve this thing. Maybe free enterprise, he said, had been too passive and allowed the government to take care of everything under a liberal and democratic regime. Now here he's thinking obviously of the New Deal and Roosevelt, all the rest of that. Perhaps the business had been too passive. And maybe the corporate forces in the United States ought to try and figure out a way that they can start running things. They ought to get more energetic about things and ought to change their whole attitude toward politics. And especially ought to arm the think tanks. I want to make sure these think tanks didn't just come up willy-nilly, but had the sponsorship of the leaders of free enterprise and argued for free enterprise, encouraged studies for free enterprise, influenced the universities to argue and fight for free enterprise, instead of letting everything just go and according to a notion of freedom, academic freedom or something like that. No. There had to be some earnest kind of change. Big business had to get into politics and be more of a movement, you could almost say. An interesting idea, movement. Nowadays they call the Republican Party, or these some characters, and especially a lot of neo-fascist argumentation on the right, the kind of people who tried to make a coup and seize control of the government in January of this year, they call the Republican Party a movement. I think a bourgeois party in Europe is not a movement, doesn't need to be a movement, maybe shouldn't be a movement, shouldn't be ideologically driven. And maybe if it is ideologically driven, a movement of the right, which is an ideologically driven movement and which tries to get some kind of mass following behind it, that's a fascist movement. So maybe the United States didn't want to go down this road. I mean, I would be among the people advising the Republicans nowadays, don't go down this road. Um, it's been tried before. It's produced some frightening results. Do want to do this? Stick with democracy. Well, at any rate, Rockefeller did make a kind of an impassioned argument of that sort, and something quite similar came forward from a man who was shortly to be appointed to be a Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, in a memorandum he issued that being publicized in 1971. Note the date. The publication of this thing is 8 days after the United States decides to close the gold window. It's interesting. And what is Powell saying? Same thing. The media have been left to various kinds of people, too pluralistic. Business ought to really have the dominant influence in the media. Business ought to have the dominant influence in academia. Academic freedom and a plurality of opinions, that's getting us into a terrible mess. Business ought to really take these things over. We have to put up the money. We ought to found a number of foundations. We ought to produce a propaganda, agitation, theory, ideology on a grand scale. We've got the money to do it. It's time to do it. To have a really corporate kind of system in the United States rather than a democratic system of such a plural and how to put it, such a plural and such a meandering, flaccid sort of character. So this is a call to arms. Well, in fact, both these things. In fact, they're not the only ones. There are several others. Calls to arms for the right. Get the right going. Get business going. Get business into government. Well, that was an important kind of suggestion, because that was really going to take root, not to the extent that it did in the 70s, but going to take root 10, 20, even perhaps 30 years later. And in these calls, you can't say that even if the American elites weren't feeling themselves embattled at home, you can't say that they didn't have some consolation. Some things were going their way. De Gaulle, for example, who'd been a real thorn in the side. You could say de Gaulle is probably the serpent of the agonies of the Bretton Woods system. You definitely could see de Gaulle playing a big role, as I've been arguing, in the fight against the dollar in the 1960s. Well, he's completely undone by these May-June revolutionary events. They're directed against him as much as against anybody. And it wasn't a year after that before de Gaulle was contemplating leaving power, and he did. He did leave the government, found an excuse to get out of the government. And Gaullism becomes much less important. At any rate, it doesn't have the driving force of that fabulous, towering personality. So that's a kind of a plus for the United States. It hasn't got the Gaullist threat in quite the same proportions, and that's going to ebb. That's going to be less and less, this Gaullist threat, as we go on. The Bandung leaders, all the leaders who led the Third World, about whom we've been speaking, there are quite a few of them. The major ones have gone by the board. Sukarno overthrown by that coup in 1965, and Nasser died at the end of the 60s. Kwame Nkrumah, the inspiration for Martin Luther King and some others, he's overthrown. So that's a kind of an encouragement to those who think the United States doesn't have to face this revolution without any cards to play. The development of Israel, which Lyndon Johnson managed to do, that in fact changed the whole orientation of the United States toward Israel over what the Republicans had pursued and what Jack Kennedy had pursued. Changed the line entirely and armed them to the teeth in 1967. And they emerged as a tremendous power, almost dominant power in the Middle East, and you might even say, as we have already suggested, a kind of middle rank nuclear power, and power which no longer, additional thing, no longer depends on France. So it's France that has been the main supporter of the Israeli nuclear program, and the main supporter of the Israelis generally in the early 60s, and now they've switched over to the United States. So that's another thing that seems to be rolling the way of the suggestions that there can be a renaissance against this revolutionary tide. That's a kind of an encouragement. Well, as we've already suggested, the Gaulle window closes in August of 1971, and Nixon comes into power in 1969 without any kind of a hint that this is going to emerge, but that's one of the first things he's got to face, is this total collapse of his position. By this time, though, he's made an opening to China, and he's made an opening on détente to Russia, especially with the motivation for the Russians, as Kissinger explains it, of friendliness of the United States with China. And the Russians, when they see the Americans and the Chinese on friendly terms, it motivates them to play ball with the United States. Henry Kissinger explains this in some detail in the first volume of his memoirs. And of course, there's something to it, except for the idea that it's going to help any of these machinations among the great powers are going to help win the war in Vietnam. Nothing's going to help there. Nothing's going to help. And Kissinger, of course, advertised that this would do the trick. In Vietnam, did not do the trick. All right. So on the closure of the Gaulle window, we now get a number of projects coming forward. The new international economic order is produced mainly by the Algerians, by Uri Boumediene. Have I got a picture of him? There he is. Uri Boumediene, president of Algeria at this time. Algeria is one of the very radical states in terms of its domestic policy. And it's kind of radically oriented abroad too, but it's just not, it's not helping guerrillas or doing anything like that that's out of the ordinary. And Boumediene judged that in view of the fact that the dollar had collapsed and one didn't know what the dollar was worth anymore, OPEC, the producers of oil, they had to start to organize a new international order. And he started to put a project like that together. Eventually, it got some votes in the UN. And the project was, I think we could call it a kind of a project for a third world globalization. A globalization idea built around OPEC. So the poorest nations of the world, third world, non-European nations, non-Soviet nations, they have a globalization project. He got it through the UN General Assembly. It contemplated nationalization of oil in a large scale and cooperation, cartelization, essentially, of the oil industry. That's another interesting globalized idea that involves state-to-state conception, not a Ricardian notion of globalization, but a state-to-state idea of it. And very, very popular in the General Assembly, and got a splendid reception there, but it really went nowhere. Getting something through the General Assembly doesn't mean much. So this idea really went nowhere, but gave an indication of the ambitions of the third world. And of course, these are enormously feared and worried about by the elites in the United States, who have a few ideas of their own up their sleeve. One of them, the leading one, the key one, is trilateralism. Let me pause for a minute. So the other idea that we need to talk about is trilateralism. And that is the project of David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. There's a rather lurid picture of Brzezinski on the left, Kissinger in the center, Rockefeller. And Rockefeller records in his memoirs, very interesting read, by the way, for those of you who are interested in these things, records their first efforts with this idea of trilateralism. So what's trilateralism? It's pretty much theorized by Zbigniew Brzezinski. So between Brzezinski and Rockefeller, this trilateralism is essentially their idea, and it's got its own particular ideology and geopolitics. And the perception is presented by Brzezinski, who argues a couple of things. Let me just say very briefly in a couple of books that Brzezinski wrote during this period. He lays out the argument that all of the revolutionary stuff in the 60s, all of the radical movements and everything really, is a sign that the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, is incompatible with the technotronic age, he says. Age of techno-electronic technology, he says. That's the new age we're in. We need a new ideology entirely for our movement. The elite is a movement now. And in this technotronic era, the intelligentsia, which is raised on the idea of pluralism and intellectual freedom and all the rest of that sort of stuff, has to give way to a technical intelligentsia, technically, who is interested in only the technical side of things. And these people will come out of the sciences and out of math rather than out of the liberal arts. As if he had any contact with any of these people on any of the university campuses during the 60s. I think most of the radicalism that came out of the university came out of the science students. They were the most radical people, most clever, most inventive, not the liberal arts students particularly, among whom I would even detect a strain of conservatism, a kind of a worrisome attitude about all of the movements of the period. But once the science people got into it, technical people, math and all those fields, what we would today, I guess, call STEM, once those students got into it on the various campuses, it really became a very, very militant, very together kind of movement that it hadn't been previously. But anyhow, Brzezinski was arguing this line for the purposes of creating an ideology, and there it was. There was the argument. It was the liberal arts students that caused the trouble in the world, and we had to depend more on what we would call today the STEM students. That's the first idea. And the second idea is that, and this one I think is much more to the point and a much more interesting idea for us, the idea that the European balance of power is kaput. And that from this point on, Europeans are not going to count for much. Henry Kissinger, who Brzezinski hated like sin, that those two guys absolutely antagonistic toward one another for years and years. They were both students at Harvard together and knew each other and very, very violently opposed one to the other. Ambitious guys, and both of them, as you know, very brilliant guys. So Brzezinski said that Kissinger's enthusiasm for his year of Europe, which he thought 1973 was going to be, did not turn out that way, and which some kind of new intimacy and post-Gaullist Atlanticism would emerge from his negotiations in Europe. Brzezinski said this is not adequate. Europe is through, he said, as a force in world affairs. It has been for centuries, but those days are over now. And what we need now is more global conception. And the global conception is across two oceans. So the United States needs to be intimate with Europe, but also needs to be intimate with Japan. the contacts across these lines are going to form a kind of consensus and ideological and spiritual unity around which the globe is going to be organized. And this one, of course, with the United States, as you can see in the center. So trilateral. So one line out to Japan, one line out to Europe. This responds to the fact that these various meetings of Bilderbergers and others, meetings of elites, David Rockefeller had found that they were resistant. They wanted to be essentially meetings of European elites, and they didn't want to allow the Japanese in. Because the Japanese are getting very important economically, but even so, they didn't want to even have them as part of their elite gathering. And David Rockefeller wanted to go beyond that, have a more broad kind of conceptual framework for these more grand meetings. As you can see, as Brzezinski is arguing, they're across two oceans. The United States is a two-ocean power. That's the way we're going to organize globalism. This is a very sophisticated conception of globalism, which is emerging among these people. They're very, very powerful people. They're going to have people in governments and especially in our government. The two leading foreign policy national security advisors for the Democratic and Republican Party now are both intimately involved in this conception of trilateralism, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. So this is I think this is really globalism. We're starting to really recognize it as such, very much to the point. And Brzezinski is the great theorist, and here's a statement attributed to Rockefeller. I'm not even sure if this is correct, by the way, if he put it exactly this way, but this is the idea that they usually attribute to Rockefeller. He's trying to create a world government. And it's perfectly true. and Brzezinski, and I use a photo of Brzezinski from a study. It's virtually the only serious study. Although Kissinger has piles and piles of serious studies. This is virtually the only serious study of Brzezinski, and he deserves it as much as Kissinger, maybe more in some ways. But anyhow, Brzezinski is going to be the theorist of this notion of trilateralism. This is globalism. This is the beginning of the globalism that we are supposed to be studying in this course. He is the big intellectual force behind it, and the conception of who was going to lead it, who would actually have power, who would be the American president they were going to promote. The person was going to be Nelson Rockefeller. So there's David and Nelson engaged in a celebration, and Nelson was going to be the main figure around which they were going to organize their thoughts. All right, so we have the end of Bretton Woods, we have the end of the gold standard, we have the events of 1971, we have the reaction of the world to the fact that the dollar is not exactly worth anything, at least in terms of precious metal anymore. And the whole question is, should you start getting out of the dollar? So it may be that the dollar is going to be on a downward slide from this point on. And what occurs immediately after that, this rush into commodities is already underway. Get out of the dollar, get into something more solid, is the sense. H.L. Hunt, for example, in Texas Oil Man, he and his sons, they tried to buy up all the silver in the world at this time. And they said it straightforwardly and frankly, silver is okay, anything rather than paper money, anything rather than the dollar. So that's it's already the mood before the OPEC countries, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, before they staged their boycott during the Middle Eastern War in 1973. So here's a graph that gives us an indication of the general thing, and it also makes an attempt to to connect it with some events. But we're going to see this this curve going the way it goes. We're going to see this curve. All right, wait a second. Get myself straightened out here. I don't know if I should show you that curve. Let's look at this curve. There's a better one. There's the curve I'm looking for. Forgive the delay here. Here's the price of gold and the price of crude oil. This tells us an interesting story. Let's look at the period down in here. Let's look at the period between 1970, when these people come into power, and the Republicans come into power, and 1975. So that'll take us through the first oil shock. You can see the gold is leading oil through all of this. People are trying to get out of the dollar. The oil shock, you might say, is part of this movement toward gold. That isn't exactly so, but it's a way of thinking of it that I think is very suggestive to us. It's an attempt by the producers of the key commodity to keep up with the decline in the value of the thing they're selling it for, the dollar. So the dollar's value is going down, and that is reflected exactly in the price of gold. The price of gold is going up. So as the price of gold goes up, they want to get more and more for their goal. In fact, they become motivated powerfully to get more and more. You can already see that with the projects for the new international economic order with Boumediene and the Algerians, projects for a new economic order. So it all begins then, the oil shock. So this is a familiar look on a graph, and I'm going to show you a lot of graphs for the period gold, oil, even interest rates. And you're going to see they pretty much go along the same track. They track each other. So here you can see the track. You can see between 70 and 75, there's the big jump. That's the first oil shock. Then you see a leveling off for the rest of the 70s. And by the end of the 70s, once the Shah of Iran is overthrown, there's a second oil shock. And then once again, you see the red line leap forward. So you're going to see that two steps there. The first oil shock, leveling off, second oil shock, and then there's a declining action. That is the action of the swing producer and some other factors we need to talk about, the opening up of commodities exchanges in Chicago and the futures market and some other factors like that, which we'll talk about in great length when we get into the 80s. But that is the general picture we're going to be following from this point on. Those two oil shocks take us through the 70s, and then there's the decline. And that decline from the peak in the thing in 1981, we attribute to the action of Saudi as a swing producer, most importantly, however, to the interest rate question. Paul Volcker raising interest rates to 20%. That is to say, the second, or I should say the Volcker shock, they call this. So the two oil shocks and the Volcker shock, those are the things that we'll be following. This general chart gives us a very sharp indication of the tendency. And we're going to be embellishing on this and indicating more about it, trying to attribute some political events to it as well. But this is and to explain these attempts at explaining these movements on the curve. But the essential point, gold and oil, they go parallel. And oil, if anything, tails behind gold. You see it is until into the 21st century, it's tailing behind gold. We're going to have a moment when that is not quite the case, but up to this point, I think that could be truly said that the oil price actually is tailing gold. At any rate, they're going together. And that is our major thought. Whether this is on account of trilateralism or not, you can ask that. Well, there you see the same things. So there's a first oil shock, and then there's a leveling off, and then there's the Iranian Revolution, second oil shock. Then there's a big leveling off, which we're going to once again interpret in terms of the Volcker shock, raising of interest rates, and the Saudis acting as a swing producer. That's increasing production to try and lower the price of oil, cutting against OPEC, in other words, to help the United States to keep oil prices down, and that's going to have an effect on gold. We're going to have the same thing with gold. That is to say, it's all done for the sake of the dollar, for the sake of the dollar. All right. And of course, the attendant agonies in the United States can be imagined. And of course, the big driver in it, according to much of the literature on the topic, is the Shah of Iran, although all of the OPEC members are eager for increases in price. They all love this sort of thing. Saudis love it really no less than the Shah of Iran. But the Shah gives the major pressure. And this is probably the most widely read, I think, and most authoritative, since it's got so much primary material, so many documents in its bibliography. The most authoritative kind of study of the oil shocks, and it puts the Shah of Iran, his desire to be a regional influential, that's Zbigniew Brzezinski's term, in the wake of the solvency, the development of solvency. The United States is not going to be active in the world so much, so regional powers can come up. Now, the Guam Doctrine suggests that we ought to give all sorts of weapons to the Shah and let the Shah do it. Same way we're Vietnamizing the war, we will be Iranizing or Shahifying the Middle East and the strategic issue there. And of course, we can rely on him against the Soviets. And so he will be our regional influential. And the Shah can't get enough U.S. weapons. It's a question of whether the United States is willing to give him all the weapons that he wants. But he's the driving force in the whole thing. The Saudis come second, but they're in there. And they're a little bit more susceptible to American pressure. And then the attendant notion that comes with this, that it's not just the Shah, it's not just the United States, excuse me, not just the Shah, not just the Saudis, but it is the United States that's behind it all. That the United States has secretly lobbied and given a green light to the oil powers to effect this shock. And to what end? In order to recycle the euro dollars, all these dollars that have been calling for gold, that have caused the Bretton Woods system to collapse, to recycle them by making them pay for oil. Europe has the major countries that were rising up against the United States. Europe didn't have, at this time, much oil. The rise in oil prices will affect Europe and the United States more than it will affect anybody else in the world. The United States is going to get punished in this, but the American oil companies, they're cut in. Sheikh Yamani put it very precisely that way, that having the American oil companies in such a position to make so much from this development of the oil shock, it gives us a buffer, he says, between us and the ire that would develop on the part of the Americans who were put in this terrible, debilitating position as a result of the oil shock. So all of this comes from Sheikh Yamani. He's the oil minister for Saudi Arabia, so that's why his viewpoint has been taken very seriously about this. And he says Kissinger is the one. Kissinger is the one who told the Shah, who encouraged the Shah in the OPEC meeting in Tehran in December of 1973, to insist on $14. That was a big leap from $5. So to insist on a big jump in the price of oil, and it is the Americans who are really behind it. Now, why are they behind it? Because they want all of these euro dollars to end up among the OPEC powers, the oil producing countries. And once they get all this money, they're eventually going to put this money in New York banks. So David Rockefeller says that after this happens, huge amounts, and Frieden gives you some figures on this, start coming into the New York banks. The New York banks have to figure out something to do. A lot of these CDs, he says, they need to be paid off. How's the United States going? What the United States going to do with this money that's all coming in? And the answer they come up with is sovereign loans. Sovereign loans to the NOPECs. That figures countries that are going to have to be buying oil at new prices. And their oil bill is going to be staggering from this point on. They got to borrow the money. We're going to loan them the money. We're going to look a little bit down the line. When the moment comes when they can't pay the money anymore, then we'll give them advice about how they can get more from us through the IMF. And we'll set up a series of conditions for that, organize their economy to make free enterprise more easily, give it an easier entrance. So that in effect, the whole world's being arranged. All the money flows in the world are being rearranged. And the economic policies, to boot, are being rearranged to suit the dollar, to suit the biggest financial organizations. Globalization, through this mechanism, the strange triangle, Frieden calls it on page 370. Note this well, the way Frieden describes this. This strange triangle puts American finance at the top of the world, which has been reshaped, essentially, through the oil shocks. And all of this done, at least according to Sheikh Yamani, done consciously through American agitation. There's some other people who argue it as well, not just Sheikh Yamani. All right, so there's the argument, and there is the whole shape of globalism, the globalized system. By the way, Raoul Prebisch and import substitution industrialization, they go by the board under these circumstances. So this is a real reshaping of the entire world economy. And Sheikh Yamani says that he is mainly its architect, and he's of course working very closely with the authors of Trilateralism. The eurodollars have become petrodollars. So there's our familiar graph again. And here's some attempts to plug in references to some major political events and a few economic ones. And you can see there's the picture. We're moving along up to 73. Then we get the first oil shock, the big leap. Then we get a leveling off in the mid-70s. Then we get the second oil shock with the Iranian Revolution. And then we come down again with the Volcker shock. So this is going to see the same graph. I'll refer to this graphs there reinforce these tendencies as we proceed in our discussion of the next 10 or 20 years from this point on. How about the argument that all this had to do with the exhaustion of Keynesianism and inflation, or that stagflation defeated Keynesianism? Let's take a look a little further down the line. Milton Friedman made this argument against Keynesianism. This is a kind of ideological, how to put it, ideological effect of the development of globalism. He's been arguing against Keynes for some time. During the 1960s in Newsweek, He's publishing a lot of arguments against Keynes, but he's just making these general right-wing arguments that were made back in the 30s by the opponents and critics of Roosevelt. So there's nothing really unusual about that sort of stuff, except the vehemence with which Friedman made these arguments. Although, even though he is vehement, there are times when he says he admires Keynes and all that. Or in the video clip that you see, he says if Keynes had lived, he would not be a Keynesian. So we can blame it on Paul Samuelson, the person who did the textbook that I used when I took Econ 1A, who was a Keynesian. I'll talk more about this Keynes and the Keynesians question as we go on. Let's not stop for it now. But the important point is that the argument that Friedman now gets to make, which is sort of an argument on general principles in the 1960s, now becomes an argument for saying that there is such a thing as stagflation, and we can blame that on Keynes, and that's another reason for abandoning Keynes. Let's see if I have a stagflation diagram. Well, here's one. So there you see the price of oil going wildly through the ceiling, and there are the two steps again. The first oil shock over in 73, and then the leveling off, then the second oil shock in 79, and we go up to a high point, but then look at the figures for GDP growth during that period, how low they go. And in other words, they go the opposite. The GDP curve goes the opposite of the oil price curve, so that we have the GDP in the 1980s going into negative territory in a big way. That figures with 20% interest rates. How are you going to have any business? Well, that is the classical deflationary policy, as Friedman explains in the 19th century very, very articulately. So there it is. The growth of the oil price then is accompanied by the decline of the economy in general, the decline of production, stagnation. All right, and so there's your inflation, the consumer price index, and there's a curve. So the inflation follows the oil. So that is not a Keynesian stagflation, it is a petroleum oil shock stagflation, excuse me. All right, that figures. A country that has to spend so much on oil can't spend it on its favorite projects, and so business is bad. So the effect of the thing is deflationary, basically. It's all this money that can't go into investment. And similarly, you're paying more for oil, so everything else goes, all the other commodities are going up with the oil, and so you have higher prices. So you have stagflation, not Keynesian, but unique to these circumstances and unique to the things we're talking about. Not unique, not an exhaustion of the Keynesian tradition. No, I've never been able to see it that way. Nevertheless, I stress this because this has become the doctrine. So if we want to criticize the doctrine the way we've been doing with all these graphs, we have to realize we're swimming against the tide of what would you say, the general noised around, brooded about, ideological way of describing Keynesianism through all of this. All right, so there we have it. The great transformation that's been developed in the world economy. And the whole world, in effect, reshaped on account of oil. You might say reshaped because of OPEC. And there you have various leaders of the West, including Richard Nixon, along with Pompidou and Edward Heath. And they're at gunpoint, presumably, before OPEC. But the argument is that the Yamani school and all of the sympathizers with that, and there are many, The argument is the Americans have done this in the first place, and the Saudis are doing our bidding because we are threatening them during this period with invading. In fact, Kissinger is on record for discussing the whole question of invading Saudi Arabia. So that's how we get them to do our will, according to this mode of interpretation, which is not easily dismissed, in my opinion. All right. So we should also note, before we drop this topic, that the world is revolutionary at this time, and the Portuguese went through almost exactly the same thing that we did in Vietnam. They were fighting in Angola and in Mozambique this whole time, and in Guinea-Bissau more than those two. And they lose that war and have a revolution in Portugal. So you have the prospect of a communist regime in Europe during this period, a communist regime in Europe. And then prior to that, we have the Pinochet government taking power in Chile. So they are still revolutionary and counter-revolutionary events going on throughout this period. Portugal's empire now breaks out in revolution. And then Nixon leaves power. The Watergate question. So Nixon apparently sent some burglars to look for evidence about Daniel Ellsberg in Democratic headquarters. And these people were caught, and Nixon's going to be driven out of power because of this. So he's going to resign. And on the way out, he gets rid of Spiro Agnew, his vice president, and appoints Gerald Ford in his stead. So Ford becomes the new president, not Agnew. And when Ford comes to power, he appoints Nelson Rockefeller. Extraordinary series of events. Russians are looking at these things and they're saying, what on earth is propelling the rise of Nelson Rockefeller? Nobody is voting for him. He is going to come to the top. So all the Russian speculation during this period, wondering about this, unable to make sense of it. The rapid rise of Nelson Rockefeller. There's Nelson Rockefeller arguing with one of the members of the Lyndon LaRouche's organization, who's complaining to him about the machinations of the American elite, and Nelson Rockefeller is giving his opinion with the one-digit salute. And one of the other appointees in the new Ford administration, the Ford-Rockefeller administration, we have to say, which might have become the Rockefeller administration if two assassination attempts, either one of two assassination attempts against Ford, had been successful. But it is the Ford administration. Also has as Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld's sidekick, Richard Cheney. And in 1975, they managed to convince Ford to drop Nelson Rockefeller from the 1976 ticket. This is a tremendous blow, not just to Rockefeller. He was devastated, David Rockefeller tells us in his memoirs, at being removed from the ticket. But it's a blow against trilateralism. It's a blow against this whole global system. And these fellows represent something else in the Republican Party, the forces represented by Governor Ronald Reagan in California, and the forces associated with what we might have been calling the Goldwater Southern Rim. According to the theories of Carl Oglesby, at any rate, in his interesting studies, the Yankee Cowboy War. I don't buy everything he says in this Yankee Cowboy War, but I think in a way there's no denying the general fact of the split in the forces of the Republican Party. You can even see them today. Split between the northern forces and the extreme rightist forces that are backed up by this realignment that has given the South to the Republicans rather than the Democrats. So we'll be talking more about the Yankee Cowboy War, especially when the leading cowboy, Ronald Reagan, will become president. But that's not the case. It's not going to be Reagan for a while because it could not get past could not get Ford past the election of 1976. And Ford would have represented centrist forces vis-a-vis the Yankees and the Cowboys in the Republican Party. It would have been like Nixon in that way. But once he's gone, the Cowboys under Ronald Reagan will get control of the Republican Party and they'll come to power. But before that, we have a very interesting interlude when the Trilateral Commission turns to a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski's and David Rockefeller's, a peanut farmer from Georgia, Jimmy Carter, and uses its influence to elevate him to the position of the Democratic nominee. He's going to win the election in 1976. He represents moderate left-wing forces, democracy, Democratic Party, but a Democratic Party that is no longer the New Deal Party of Franklin Roosevelt, but is now a globalist neoliberal party. We'll have to talk more about what neoliberalism is in our future discussions. So all these very exciting and tumultuous events about which we could have devoted whole programs on their own, all have to be grasped by us. We have to watch the logic of them, and we have to try to make sense of them as we continue. So we'll deal with the neoliberals in the Carter administration and all the other neoliberals as we proceed.